Amadeus Balu Meyer. Meyer was 16 years old when he brutally murdered his best friend's mother with a baseball bat in Topeka, Kansas. The case shocked the local community due to the close relationship between the killer and the victim's family. Balu Meyer grew up in Topeka, Kansas. Details regarding his specific school enrollment or academic performance are largely shielded under juvenile privacy regulations. During court hearings, it was established that he had been an exceptionally close fixture in the victim's household. He was the best friend of the victim's 16-year-old son, Dylan J., and had been visiting their home 3 to 4 days a week for several months leading up to the homicide. Aside from his proximity to the family, court disclosures by the Shawnee County District Attorney's Office revealed a darker undercurrent to his behavior. At the time of his prosecution for the murder, Balu Meyer was also facing charges in an unrelated juvenile crimes case. Esther Workman was a 46-year-old resident of Topeka. She was highly respected professionally, working as a legal support staff supervisor for the Kansas State Board of Healing Arts. Her family described her as a loving mother who enjoyed puzzles, true crime shows, and reading. Because Balu Meyer was her son's best friend, she knew him well and had regularly welcomed him into her home. The crime occurred on the afternoon of April 24, 2021. 16-year-old Balu Meyer secretly sneaked into the residence while Workman was home alone. Following his arrest, he confessed to detectives that his original intention was to scare Workman. He waited by the interior steps leading up from the garage into the house and shoved her as she walked by. Workman fell backward down the stairs and struck her head. Claiming he panicked when she fell, Balu Meyer grabbed a nearby baseball bat and launched a vicious assault, beating her repeatedly over the head until she died from severe head trauma. The kid fled the scene on foot and threw the bloody baseball bat into the nearby creek. The weapon was later recovered by disc golfers and handed over to the police. Later that day, Workman's 16-year-old son arrived home with a friend and discovered his mother's body lying in the garage. Topeka Police Department detectives quickly unraveled the case. Neighbors' home security surveillance footage captured a boy running down the street away from the house carrying a baseball bat. When shown the footage, Workman's grieving son immediately identified the running figure as his best friend. Noting the sophistication and gravity of the offense, the judge ruled that Balu Meyer would be prosecuted as an adult. To avoid a prolonged trial, he accepted a plea agreement. On July 22, 2022, the 17-year-old pleaded guilty to intentional and premeditated first-degree murder, resulting in the dismissal of 4 minor-related charges. On October 12 the same year, Balu Meyer received his sentence, life in prison. Under Kansas law for premeditated adult murder, he received a Hard 50 restriction, meaning he must serve a minimum mandatory term of 50 years before he is eligible to even see a parole board. He will not be eligible to apply for parole until 2071, at which point he will be 66 years old. If he is ever granted parole in the future, he will remain under intensive state supervision for the remainder of his natural life. Alex Barani and David Anderson. Barani and Anderson were 17 years old when they plotted and carried out what is known as the Bellevue murders or the Bellevue massacre. Driven primarily by an unsettling desire to experience the thrill of killing, the pair murdered an entire family of 4 in Bellevue, Washington in 1997. Barani and Anderson grew up in the affluent suburb of Bellevue, Washington. In the period leading up to the crime, both boys had severely unraveled socially and academically. The two teenagers were heavily entrenched in a localized Gothic subculture. They routinely dressed in all-black trench coats, wore white face paint, and spent their nights drinking coffee and smoking at a local Denny's. They were deeply obsessed with intensive dark fantasy role-playing games involving teams of vampires and demons, so much so that an informal local gaming group kicked them out for taking the dark roleplay to a disturbing extreme. Both boys originally attended Bellevue High School. However, they both ultimately dropped out of the traditional school structure and briefly enrolled in the off-campus school, an alternative educational program in Bellevue, before dropping out of that as well in November 1996. Following their arrests, Parani's defense revealed a deeply fractured childhood. He felt entirely abandoned after his parents' divorce, and a psychologist formally diagnosed him with bipolar disorder. Conversely, prosecutors presented Anderson as a deeply detached, narcissistic individual who was highly fascinated by blades and weapon collections. The victims were members of the Wilson family, who lived in Bellevue's quiet Woodridge neighborhood. William Wilson was 52, the father. Rosalie Wilson was 46, the mother. Kimberly Ann Wilson, 20, was the eldest daughter. She was a former classmate of the boys and had previously treated Anderson like a little brother before they had a social falling out. Julia Wilson was 17 and the youngest daughter. The meticulous massacre took place during the late evening of January 3, 1997, and the early hours of January 4. Court records later revealed that Parani and Anderson had deliberately spent over a year planning a homicide. They explicitly timed the crime to occur before their 18th birthday under the calculated strategic belief that their minor status would shield them from the death penalty. The two teens paged and lured 20-year-old Kimberly Wilson to meet them at the Woodridge Water Tower Park under the guise of hanging out. Once inside the park, Barani wrapped a garrote wire around Kimberly's neck and strangled her to death, while Anderson violently kicked and stomped on her. Realizing that Kimberly's family would quickly notice she was missing or identifying them as the last people to see her, the pair decided to execute the rest of the household to eliminate witnesses. They drove straight to the Wilson home, slipped inside, and launched a horrific multi-room blitz. Using baseball bats and hunting knives, they attacked the sleeping family. Bill, Rose, and 17-year-old Julia were all bludgeoned, stabbed in the throat, and strangled to death in their beds and hallways. Police caught the pair days later after acquaintances informed detectives that Anderson had spent months bragging that he was going to commit a massive murder. Upon their arrests, Barani gave a full confession detailing the killings, while Anderson's bloody boots firmly tied him to the crime scene. Because of the immense planned brutality of the massacre, both were tried as adults in separate high-profile trials. They were both convicted of 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Barani and Anderson were originally sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. However, sweeping systemic changes regarding juvenile justice heavily altered their terms. Following the 2012 U.S. Supreme Court ruling making mandatory life without parole terms for juveniles unconstitutional, Washington state mandated that both men receive new, discretionary sentencing hearings. King County Superior Court Judge Michael Scott re-evaluated Anderson's file. Under Washington guidelines prohibiting de facto life sentences for minors, the judge resentenced Anderson to a minimum of 33 years in prison. Facing his own review, prosecutors argued that Barani's extreme actions could not be attributed to mere youthful impulsivity. Judge Jason Poydras ultimately adjusted his term, sentencing him to a minimum of 46 years to life. David Anderson is serving his 33-year minimum term. Having been incarcerated since his January 1997 arrest, he is projected to become eligible to apply for parole consideration in 2030. Alex Barani is serving his 46-year minimum term. Accounting for the time he has already served since 1997, he is scheduled to remain securely behind bars until at least 2043 before he is permitted his first face-to-face review with a state parole board. Antonio Barbeau and Nathan Pop. Barbeau and Pop were both just 13 years old when they carried out the horrific, pre-planned bludgeoning and robbery of Barbeau's 78-year-old great-grandmother in Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin. Both boys grew up in Sheboygan. They were close friends and typical middle school students when the crime occurred in September 2013. Barbeau had a highly unstable childhood leading up to the crime. When he was 10 years old, he was struck by a car, sustaining a severe traumatic brain injury. A psychiatrist later testified that this structural injury caused lingering cognitive and behavioral issues, leaving him highly impulsive. At the time of the murder, Barbeau was a runaway who had recently broken out of a juvenile detention center. He was secretly staying with Pop's family. Pop lived with his parents and had no major prior history of violent behavior. However, during the trials, prosecutors and judges characterized him as a highly impressionable follower who easily succumbed to peer pressure. Barbara Olson was 78 years old and lived alone. She was a kind, deeply caring great grandmother who frequently welcomed Barbo into her home and hired him to do yard work. On the day of the attack, seeing the boys outside, she warmly invited them inside out of concern that they would be cold. The senseless killing occurred on September 17, 2012. Needing money to buy Mary Jane and pizza, Barbo formulated a plan to rob his great grandmother, knowing she had money in the house. The boys armed themselves with a hatchet and a claw hammer. Upon entering the house, Olson jokingly told Barbo, "Don't steal any of my money," as he had done so in the past. Moments later, Barbo launched an ambush, hitting her with the blunt side of the hatchet. He then handed the weapons to Pop, who struck her twice with the hammer. Barbo then flipped the hatchet over and struck Olson with the sharp end, lodging the blade into her skull. An autopsy later revealed the elderly woman suffered 27 total blows, including 18 caved-in wounds to her head. Barbo later chillingly described the frenzy as feeling like a video game. The boys ransacked her house, stealing jewelry, her watch, a purse, and a meager $150 in cash. They tried to load her body into her car trunk but could not lift her, leaving her covered in a blanket in the garage. They used the pillow to prop Pop up so he could see over the steering wheel and drove her car away. The next day, they used the stolen money to buy pizza, gloves, cleaning supplies, and weed. Because of the sheer brutality of the premeditated crime, Wisconsin state law mandated they be tried as adults for first-degree intentional homicide. In June 2013, Barbeau accepted a plea deal, changing his plea from not guilty by reason of insanity to no contest. During his hearing, he broke down sobbing while reading his apology. He was sentenced to life in prison and ordered to serve a mandatory minimum of 35 years before becoming eligible to apply for release to extended supervision. This will happen at age 50 in 2048. Pop maintained he acted under duress and went to a full jury trial, where Barbeau testified against him. Convicted in 2014, he was similarly sentenced to life in prison. The judge acknowledged he acted more as a follower and set his extended supervision eligibility slightly earlier, at 31 years of time served. This will be at age 45 in 2043. Over the years, both men have launched multi-tier legal appeals to overturn or reduce their sentences. Barbeau argued that sentencing a 13-year-old with a documented traumatic brain injury to prison until age 50 constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The Wisconsin Appellate Court officially rejected his appeal in 2016, affirming his original 2048 release eligibility timeline. Pop filed multiple appeals and petitioned for federal habeas corpus relief, claiming that a 31 mandatory block denied him a meaningful juvenile opportunity for rehabilitation. The federal and state courts denied his petitions, upholding his 2043 eligibility track. April Lee Barber. She was 15 years old when she and her older boyfriend murdered her adoptive grandparents by burning down their house in North Carolina. Her case became a landmark example of juvenile rehabilitation, leading to her high-profile release after 3 decades behind bars. April Barber, who is of Black and Native American descent, grew up in a highly fractured and unstable family structure in North Carolina. At just 14 years old, she became entangled in an inappropriate relationship with a 29-year-old man named Clinton Johnson. Shockingly, her biological mother encouraged the grooming and relationship. April quickly became pregnant by Johnson. Because of her chaotic biological home, she had been adopted by her maternal grandparents. Her grandparents were deeply troubled by the statutory essay and pregnancy, and they began heavily pressuring the 15-year-old to undergo an abortion. Aaron Barber and Lily Barber were April's loving, protective maternal grandparents who had legally adopted her to shield her from an unstable environment. They were deeply concerned for her future and opposed her relationship with an adult man twice her age. The double homicide occurred in 1991. Desperate to keep her unborn baby, April turned to her 29-year-old boyfriend, Clinton Johnson. Johnson took advantage of her panic and convinced her that the only way they could remain together and keep the child was to eliminate her grandparents. Together, the couple formulated a plan to stage a fatal house fire. They intentionally set ablaze Aaron and Lily Barber's home while the elderly couple was inside. Both grandparents died from smoke inhalation and thermal injuries in the blaze. April was arrested shortly after the arson and faced 2 counts of first-degree murder at age 15. A few weeks after her arrest, April gave birth to her son Colt. In a stark display of strict protocols, she was forced to give birth while chained to a hospital bed before saying a sudden goodbye to her newborn, who was placed with a family friend. For her own protection as a pregnant minor in an adult environment, she spent her first 334 consecutive days in total isolation inside a jail cell. To avoid the potential death penalty trial, April accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to first-degree murder. She was handed 2 consecutive life prison sentences. Under the laws of the early 1990s, her sentence meant she would not be eligible to apply for regular parole until she reached the age of 55. While incarcerated at the Anson Correctional Institution, April completely transformed her life over 31 and a half years. She completed her high school education and took horticulture classes. She eventually turned to literature, writing and publishing 4 books from prison, including an autobiography detailing her journey titled Fenced In, Fighting for Freedom. While incarcerated, she met a man named Tommy Scales who was visiting another inmate. The two fell in love and were married in a prison ceremony. Following extensive changes in scientific understanding regarding adolescent brain development, North Carolina established the Juvenile Sentencing Review Board. In March 2022, Governor Ray Cooper used the board's recommendations to grant April Barber clemency and commute her life sentences. She was officially released from the Anson Correctional Institution on March 24, 2022, at the age of 45. She successfully completed her 3-year mandatory probation period and is entirely free. Today, she lives with her husband and has fully reconnected with her adult son, Colt. Professionally, she works as a healthcare aide, personal trainer, and a recovery coach. She is a heavily vocal community advocate alongside justice organizations, traveling to legislative events to lobby for the dismantling of extreme life sentences for juvenile offenders. Dana Barker. Dana Marie Barker was 17 years old when she ambushed and fatally shot her former stepmother inside an Oklahoma residence. Her case gained prominent national coverage on the A&E docuseries Kids Behind Bars: Life or Parole, as it highlights the legal battles regarding juvenile life sentences and the controversial influence of co-defendants or masterminds. Dana Barker grew up in Pittsburgh County, Oklahoma, living near McAlester. Her adolescence was highly unstable and marked by behavioral issues. As a teenager, she dropped out of high school, ran away from home, and accumulated thousands of dollars in unauthorized charges on her father's credit cards. During her later appeals, Barker and her defense team emphasized the toxic and manipulative environment created by her father, Joe David Barker. Advocacy groups and trial reviews state that the court completely failed to consider the immense pressure her father placed on her. It was later heavily alleged that her father was the driving force and mastermind behind the hostility toward his ex-wife. Brenda Barker was 37 years old at the time of the shooting. She was the ex-wife of Joe David Barker and Dana's former stepmother. She worked at a local fast food restaurant to provide for her family and lived in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. The meticulously planned attack took place on the afternoon of January 26, 1994. 17-year-old Barker traveled to Okmulgee in a rented vehicle, armed with rubber gloves and a stolen .22 caliber handgun. Before approaching the residence, Barker cut the house's exterior telephone lines to prevent Brenda from calling for help. She then knocked on the front door just after Brenda returned home from work. A physical struggle ensued in the kitchen, during which Barker shot Brenda 3 times, twice in the head and once in the abdomen. Barker then fled, leaving the victim to bleed on the floor. Brenda was discovered by her 2 sons lying in a pool of blood. Before being rushed to a Tulsa hospital, she was able to identify Dana as her attacker to first responders. At the time of arrest, police noted the motive stemmed from an intense argument over the custody and treatment of Dana's younger brother. Brenda survived on life support for 13 days before succumbing to her injuries on February 8, 1994. Because of the premeditated nature of the ambush, Barker was prosecuted as an adult in Okmulgee County. In March 1995, she entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Under the laws of Oklahoma at the time, she was sent away with no expectation of ever experiencing freedom. The state of Oklahoma has aggressively maintained that her specific case does not qualify for an automatic rollback. On October 20, 2021, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals officially affirmed the denial of her application for post-conviction relief. A subsequent federal habeas claim was also dismissed on statutory limitations guidelines in late 2022. Barker, now in her late 40s, continues to work with justice groups to advocate for her release, openly expressing that while she deserved prison time, her juvenile status and home environment should grant her a discretionary second chance. Conversely, Brenda's surviving children heavily oppose her release, frequently petitioning the courts to keep her original sentence intact so she serves out her natural life behind bars. Adam Barney. Adam Stephen Barney was just 15 years old when he brutally murdered his mother inside their family home in McKinney, Texas. The case drew significant attention due to chilling evidence that the teenager had harbored violent, psychopathic tendencies from a very young age. Barney grew up in an affluent neighborhood in McKinney, Texas, Collin County, raised by his parents, Stacy and Craig Barney. Public records regarding his formal school studies are legally limited due to his minor status at the time of the arrest. However, court proceedings painted a terrifying picture of his childhood. Prosecutors showed evidence that Barney had displayed unprovoked aggression, manipulation, and extreme behavioral issues since the age of 5. His parents had desperately spent his entire life trying to get him psychological and behavioral help. During the trial, prosecutors shared a deeply unsettling diary entry written by his mother, Stacy. The entry revealed that Barney had openly expressed an explicit desire to murder his own family members since he was just 7 years old. A forensic psychologist, Dr. Christy Compton, formally testified in court that Barney possessed the distinct clinical traits of a psychopath. Stacy Ellen Barney was 50 years old at the time of her death. She was a dedicated, loving mother who had exhausted every available resource to help her son overcome what the district attorney described as his dark characteristics. The horrific matricide occurred in the early morning hours of January 3, 2021. While Stacy was sitting peacefully on the living room couch, 15-year-old Adam walked into the garage to retrieve a weapon. He approached his mother from behind and launched a savage attack, striking her in the head 11 times with a hammer before strangling her with his hands until she completely stopped breathing. The entire murder lasted several minutes and was captured in vivid detail by the home's interior security cameras. Shortly after the killing, Barney's father, Craig, stepped out of his bedroom, completely unaware of the crime. Barney immediately charged at him, assaulting his father with a screwdriver. Fortunately, the father managed to fight him off and flee the residence to call emergency services. Barney also fled the house on foot into the night. Following a massive 7-hour manhunt utilizing police helicopters through a North Texas neighborhood, officers located him walking down a street the next morning and took him into custody. In October 2021, a judge officially ruled that Barney would stand trial as an adult. The judge noted his total lack of remorse and extreme sophistication. She noted that after the killing, Barney deliberately chose not to speak to the police and immediately questioned the legal capabilities of his defense lawyers. Furthermore, she ruled that the juvenile system possessed no services capable of rehabilitating him. In November 2022, 17-year-old Barney bypassed a full trial by pleading guilty to murder. During the sentencing phase, his defense attempted to secure a lighter sentence by arguing that he had suffered trauma from educators and previous rehabilitation treatments, but the jury rejected this angle. On November 4, 2022, a Collin County jury deliberated for 3 hours and sentenced Barney to life in prison and a $10,000 fine. Because the crime was a first-degree felony murder and did not legally meet the narrow statutory definition of a capital offense required for a true life without parole sentence in Texas, he technically retains a path to parole. Under Texas law for juvenile offenders tried as adults, Barney is required to serve a strict minimum mandatory term of 30 years before he is permitted his very first face-to-face evaluation with a state parole board. He is projected to remain securely behind bars until at least 2051, at which point he will be 45 years old. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.